Sometimes a heart can feel like a heavy weight. It pulls you under and you just fall away. Is anybody gonna hear you call? Oh, but there's a purpose under the surface, and you don't have to drown. Let me remind you that love will find you. Let it lift you out. You are beloved.
I'll tell you something else about John Donahoe. He's a lot like Ryan Pfaff. Maybe the spitting image of Ryan Pfaff. We were at dinner Tuesday night with our sup club, and I don't know if you know this about Ryan Pfaff, but he knows how to start a conversation. And Tuesday night at, I'll probably say this wrong, Votros, super good food, trotes, or whatever it is. I think that's what vo means. Anyway, we're there, and we've been there a while, and 8 of us around the table, and 7 of us are carrying on a conversation at the table, and John is talking to the guy at the booth next to him. And I'm not quite sure what their connection was. I know there was connection, but Debbie graduated high school with this guy. They were in the same class, and by the time we get up to leave for dinner, I'm not sure why this couple wasn't sitting at our table instead of standing next to it most of the night. And I loved it. It's just the way life should work, because this guy's talking about how God's blessed him and he's moving back to his parents' home from Sour Lake to Lumberton. And John's like, wrong John. John Norris is like, hey, so you got a church? I love it when those things happen and you have those conversations. It's kind of like when I heard the other day, was at dinner or eat. It sounds like all I do is eat, and that might be true, but was with Shannon and Jimmy the other night, and Jimmy tells me this amazing story about these 2 little girls who walk by while he's painting his house and beg him to help him. And he's like, no, you better go ask your mom, make sure that's okay, change clothes, and then if it all gets approved, go ahead and come back. They come back and start a youth ministry for us, right? Like, they come back, they finish painting the house, and Jimmy's like, hey, so y'all have a church? And that's just the way it works. Guys like Jimmy and John, you're my superheroes. You're people of great influence, and I appreciate it. So it probably takes just one encounter with a guy like these people that we just talked about, John and Jimmy and Ryan, or their female counterparts, because women are way better at this than men anyway. That's why we share the exceptions when men actually do these things. But this is the way a church will get built, and this is built, and this is the way Jesus built his church. And so we're in John chapter 9, which is really the beginning of the second half of John chapter 8. And not literally. You'll notice chapter 8 is labeled 8, and chapter 9 is labeled 9. But this is one story. As a matter of fact, if you were in college biology, chapter 8 is the lesson and chapter 9 is the lab. Or as some people like to put it, chapter 8 is the sermon and chapter 9 is the sermon lived out. And so that's what we're looking at when we get to chapter 9 today, and I'm excited for us to take a look at this story because, to be honest with you, I love the lab more than the lecture. Not near as many notes to take, but definitely a life-transforming experience. So let me tell you, one encounter can change everything. I had a few of these. If we wanted to go 4 hours today instead of just 2, I would tell you my white buffalo encounter. The white buffalo are sacred, and in the Black Hills when we were in Custer State Park and walking back in these hills and halfway up this cliff, I encountered the sacred white buffalo, and all of my Cub Scout friends that were with me, I was in Cub Scouts, we were amazed and we were dreaming big dreams. I mean, we were going to be on national news, which was kind of a good thing back then. I'll have to tell you that story a different time. It's kind of like one encounter with a Mack truck will change the trajectory of your life for a very long time. It's kind of like how, in my case, it was a mechanic in Kansas City that taught me how to trust God, because I coasted off the interstate into his station, and he quoted me a price to replace my master cylinder on my clutch that cost me more than the car itself did. He wanted $800 for that. I didn't pay $800 for my car. I hadn't paid that much for a car in my life till that point. And when he gave me that, I was like, well, what would you charge me to tow this car to somebody else's garage? And he said, you have a problem with trusting people, don't you? I still have a problem with trusting people. But he said, well, do you trust God? I do trust God. He said, well, why don't you trust God to take care of you in this? That mechanic, that one encounter with that mechanic, helped me trust God. I still struggle to trust people at times. Or, like what happened to us last night, I hope you'll have a chance to, if you haven't already, to meet my brother Rusty and his wife Connie. You'll forever be changed. They're really good people because they trust Jesus and lead others to do that as well. We're grateful to have them here. Last night, sorry, I don't know. I told Lindy this earlier. I cried during the announcements. I cried during worship. I don't know. I'm a little weepy today. Some of you will understand that. But we pull into the driveway last night, and our neighbor's having a crawfish boil. And he's just starting it. And Rusty and Connie, I mean, they're from Nebraska. We don't have crawfish boils in Nebraska. We might do like a low country boil or like a shrimp boil or something like that. But we don't have, crawfish. It's hard to get a crawfish to Nebraska alive, right? And you don't boil them dead and eat them, right? That's no fun. And so we pull into the driveway, and they're just starting to get the water heated up and stuff. And I'm like, hey, let's go over and talk to my neighbor. It might be the fourth conversation I've had with him. We go over there, and he's like showing us how this is all working. He's like, well, I'm going to be throwing the crawfish in a minute. Come back, and I'll let you try some. And so we have that little experience. They watch him play with them live and all the fun stuff. You can imagine like a newbie coming to a crawfish boil. It's a little different thing. I don't. Maybe you can't imagine it. I don't know. But it was an amazing experience. Unfortunately, I had one a year ago when Jake had me over to his house, but I missed the best part of it because I was busy that Saturday and didn't get there till the crawfish were cooked. But anyway, we go there, we come back out a few times, watch. I mean, we must have been a sight to them, I guess, in some ways, like total tourists living next door. And so we come over, they feed us a little bit, taste, so good, so good. We go back and eat the amazing meal that Julie already had made for us. And if you've never had snow on the mountain, come to my house and you'll have a treat someday. And John and Bonnie, you'll love it. We made it with your rice because snow on the mountain all goes on rice. And so we had that, and Julie had my birthday dessert for me, even though it's a little pre-birthday time, but we had birthday dessert and everything, and we're sitting back, letting everything kind of flow and digest and enjoying some conversation, and the doorbell rings. And this guy brings over a humongous platter that we would call a buffet and they would call a serving. Like when I went to Jake's house for my first crawfish and we dipped the dish, and everybody, I was a little late, so they said, go get your own, it's in the cooler. I go over there and I pick out 4 or 5 that look good to me, and potato and a piece of corn, and I sit down at the table and I realize everybody's got their things piled up. So I walked back over to the cooler and got more, of course. This guy brings a serving of crawfish to us. And so we go back to the table for Second Supper, and it was amazing. A life-changing encounter. Almost as life-changing of an encounter as I really should have warned my brother and sister-in-law that when you eat crawfish, you don't rub your eyes. One encounter can change things, which is what we're talking about from John chapter 9. So I want to tell you a story. And in that story, we're going to see 5 conversations take place. And here's the beautiful thing about the way Jesus teaches and the way John records Jesus' teachings. If you look at it, all through the book of John, Jesus has amazing conversations with people. And John shares those conversations. I don't know if they're word for word, but the impact of those conversations is very important. So let's start in John chapter 9. And to be honest with you, these 2 chapters are probably worthy of 2 different sermon series, not 3 or 4 sermons like we're handling them in. John chapter 9, we know is a continuation of John chapter 8, because in John chapter 8, verse 59, at this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. And it starts in chapter 9 with, as he went along. So as he leaves the temple, the crowd had gathered up. He'd already had them put down their stones earlier in John chapter 8 when he's talking to this woman and says, go and sin no more. You know, he told the crowd, you without sin, you throw the first stone, and they drop them one by one. And he's like, woman, who condemns you? And she's like, nobody. And he says, I don't either. Just go and stop this. You know, sin no more. But those people that laid their stones down, pick them up again at the end of John chapter 8. But Jesus walks away from it. And if you ask me how, I would just have to say, well, God did a thing. His disciples are with him, and they come across this blind man. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, so Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Another way that we might say this today is, or the culture would be, okay, so who's the bad karma? Is the bad karma for mom and dad, or is the bad karma this man? Some scholars even go as far as to suggest that this is kind of a continuation of that other story. Not that it was the same adulterous woman would be his mom or anything, not that. But it's the same scenario. Some people go so far as to say, is it because this man and this woman are living together and they're not married? Is it because they have a kid and they're not together? Was it their sin as parents that did this to him? And I don't know if you've ever been around somebody that has a sick baby at birth or loses a baby at birth. They ask those same questions of themselves, right? Like, what did I do? Other people say, no, this guy's blind from birth, but it was his sin. And I just scratch my head thinking, I suppose. I don't know, Donald, do blind people ever sin? I figured maybe. So maybe it was his sin. I don't know. What's funny is Jesus doesn't answer their question, typical Jesus fashion. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. Well, Jesus, we know everybody sins. But that's not what he's getting at. Probably a poor translation of what he's saying there. The important part of his phrase is what he says next. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. Can I just say a couple of things here? First of all, Jesus sees this man's pain. Jesus sees this man's pain. But he sees more than the pain. I think a lot of times we see people, we see their pain. And I want you to know that if you're here today and you're dealing with pain, Jesus sees you. And he sees your pain. And he says, you're more than your pain. You're more than your problem. You're more than your hurt. You're more than your failure. This is an opportunity for God to show off. That's what this man is. It's an opportunity for God to show off. This man had never seen a sunset, a sunrise, a crocodile. He'd never seen anything. Blind from birth. And whatever pain you bring to this moment, Jesus sees it. Jesus saw this man, and Jesus doesn't let this man continue to be simply identified as the blind man. He takes away the one identifying factor that we have for this man. You know what it meant to be a blind man in his day? This is a man that was alone. We'll find out in the next few verses. His parents weren't living with him. He wasn't living with his parents. He would go and beg. He was unemployable. In his culture, there was an assumption that his behavior caused his problem. So he dealt and lived with shame every day of his life. You could spend 5 minutes and begin to understand just looking and thinking about this man's life, and you'd recognize his blindness was it was his identity. And there were so many pieces of that defined his life. It was really the defining thing in his life up until this moment. And Jesus sees past the pain and past the problem, and he sees a man. And that's the second thing I just want to point out. Jesus doesn't tell us the cause of this man's pain, but he says that God can redeem it. He can change it. This guy doesn't have to stay the blind man. Matter of fact, in moments he won't be. He will travel to this little pool 600 yards from the temple with mud all over his face. The physical reality of mud. Jesus will, and junior high boys will love this, but Jesus picks up a little bit of dirt and dust, and he doesn't go, I think he gives it the good old country, I won't do it in the microphone, but you know what I'm saying? Like, he builds a big one because he smears it together and puts mud on this guy's eyes. There's nothing dainty about what Jesus is doing in this moment. And you might have questions about why. Why that? Well, there's 3 different times that he uses this method of spit to do a miracle. I think there's reasons for this one. You might remember in John chapter 8, Jesus said a couple of I ams. The first one is, I am the light of the world. The other one was, I'm living water. And on what was probably still the last day of the festival, the last day of the big camp out, celebrating the freedom of these people, the last day where they would ritually make the journey this blind man is about to make and fill these jars and take the water back to the temple and pour it out over the altar to remind them of God's provision for their freedom in the desert from the Egyptians. This man will be sent to the same place those people are going. He will pass all those priests, all those Pharisees hauling their water back and forth that day. He will pass them. He will be covered with mud on his face. He goes to the pool of Siloam, which if you get a chance, do a little research on this place. It's really a pretty amazing place. The pool of Siloam this is sort of a representation of it. That's what it sort of looks like today. It was wide open back then, but if you go back and you do your history, this is the only source of living water, fresh water, to the city of Jerusalem. And in Hezekiah's days, clear back in King Hezekiah's days, King Hezekiah built this 600, during his time, this huge tunnel is built to protect that water so they can get water into the city. When Nehemiah comes in and rebuilds the walls to the city, he rebuilds the Pool of Siloam and this tunnel and this long access. And so this blind man walks away from where Jesus is, goes to the pool and washes his face. You know what he sees for the very first time? What would you want to see? Like, it's your first time to ever be able to look at anything. And some of you are like, my granddaughter's face. That would be an amazing moment. I can't wait till that day, frankly. Maybe some of you are like, I've always wanted to see Alaska. You know? This man from that pool looks up, and the first thing he sees is the temple. And for us, it's hard to imagine that. Like, we've been in the presence of great structures before, right? Like Washington Monument or the Statue of Liberty or the Spindletop in Gladys. You know, one of these amazing structures, and we're like in awe of it. But what this man is looking face to face at is a temple that has been serving for generation after generation as the dwelling place of God. That's the first thing he sees. He doesn't even see Jesus. Jesus isn't there. And I don't know about you, but I can't wait till I open my eyes. And the first thing I see is I'm in the dwelling of God. You know, my dad experienced that in February. Been thinking about it all morning, you know. He shut his eyes from that bed. And he woke up there. The Pool of Siloam is the pool of being sent. That's what Siloam means. It's a place you're sent. I don't know if in this case he's sent to it. Sometimes you're sent from it. I'm not sure. And by sent, I don't mean like the smell of a crawfish boil. I mean you're going somewhere. And this guy was going somewhere. And in that moment, he opens his eyes. It's an amazing moment. Let's keep telling the story so we can get to that moment. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. I skipped over the slide, but I don't want to skip over the point. The disciples thought this was karma. And I don't get it because they've been traveling with Jesus. By then, they should have known that karma is not a Jesus thing. Karma is more of like a Buddhist thing. Karma says you're going to get it in the long run. What comes around goes around. What you do will be done to you. And Jesus says, not karma. It's not this guy's sin. It's not his parents' sin. This is an opportunity for him to be God's pride and joy. It's an opportunity for God to show off his presence and his power. I don't know about you, but I would love to live life like that. I just want my life to be a chance for God to show off. I don't want to show off. But man, Lord, do whatever it is that draws people's attention away from me and to you. And that's what he does for this guy. And in essence, what Jesus says it's all about. He goes on to clarify it. He says in verse 4, as long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. But night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. So he's drawing back on his lecture as well. I'm the light of the world. I'm the living water. Having said this, he spit on the ground and made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Told him to wash in the pool of Siloam, and this word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. And that'll spark a conversation or two. Here's a second conversation. It's with all of his neighbors. His neighbors start to ask him questions. They say things like this. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Now, this is neighbors. And I'm guessing they've been neighbors for more than a year. I've been neighbors for about a year, not even that. This guy gives me crawfish. These guys are like, this is the guy, isn't it? Some said that he was, and others said, no, he just looks like him. Which, do you ever find it amazing how far people will go to avoid believing something amazing takes place? Like how hard they'll work to explain away the miraculous. Like, I don't think that's him. Yeah, those are the clothes he wears every day, and that's his cane. I don't know if they had canes back then, but it looks exactly like him. It's kind of like Stephen Wright, the old comedian. One day he says, I came home the other day, I opened the door to my house and realized that everything I owned had been stolen and replaced with exact replicas. So I went next door and I told my neighbor this, and he said, "Who are you?" I love that old joke. I guess you have to be old to appreciate it, or maybe not quite as old as I think. But anyway, his neighbors are like, no, I think this guy might have been replaced with an exact replica of him. This might not be him. Because we'll go so far just to avoid the miraculous. But he himself, and by the way, Ryan, this should be your memory verse, maybe even your life verse. When I was a kid, this was one of my favorite verses to memorize, and I still love it. I love to quote it to my wife or other people. This man just simply says, "I am the man." I put that on a t-shirt, Grandpa. I am the man. I'm not a replica. I'm your neighbor. You've seen me before. This is my first time seeing you, but you've seen me before. I'm that guy. And verse 10, they said, "How then were your eyes opened?" they demanded. And he replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash. And so I went there and washed, and then I could see." And they're like, "Right. Where is this man?" They asked him. "You're asking the blind guy. Where's the guy that did this to you?" He'd never seen him before. Even to this point, he'd never seen Jesus. That's conversation two. That's a conversation with the neighbors. Something I love about this conversation with the neighbors is, remember the story I told you about Tiny last week? He had this t-shirt. I had this t-shirt on, "It Matters," and he's like, "Benghazi." I told you that story, I'm sure, yeah. And I was super confused. But then after that, we just start hearing stories because I told him his story mattered. And so he told me he told me a few of his stories. And this guy, his neighbor's like, "Tell us your story." And the reason is because it matters to them. There's somebody that can open the eyes of the blind. I wonder what else he can do. Or have you been faking this the whole time? Telling my brother just to say that any naughty idea I ever got probably first went through him or came from him. At least had its birth there. But he was with a group of guys wanting to be preachers, and they go to Preachers Training Institute, which was something that CIY started years ago. And one of these guys, a guy that's sponsoring a scholarship for some of our kids to go to CIY this year, or helping do that. They all walk into this restaurant together and they say, Ronnie, be blind. And Ronnie has great eyesight. He sees fine, but they spend the whole meal pretending like Ron's blind. Ron pretends like Ron's blind. And the server is watching these future preachers dump hot sauce into his Coke, like just mess with his food and be mean. And she just comes over. She keeps looking like, what are you guys doing picking on Ronnie? And she brings a check at the end. They're getting ready to leave. And I don't know if it was Rusty or one of the other guys, but they're like, hey, Ron, what time is it? And he looks at his watch. And the waitress just cracks up. She's like, oh, are you kidding me? This guy had a great story about how he could now see. And he didn't know the answer to their questions. The only answer he had for them was his very own story. And I'm here to tell you, you don't have to know who Hezekiah is. You don't have to be able to spell Saul to share Jesus with people. You just need to know your story. And you know what? They may ask you things that you don't know how to answer. This guy says, I don't know, but this is my story, and I'm sticking to it. This is what he did for me. I was blind, and now I see. Well, I don't need much more than that. His story matters. One encounter with Jesus can change everything. It changes your story. All of a sudden you see what you couldn't see before. And I'll just tell you, remember, this is the lab from the sermon of chapter 8. A lot of the explanation is in chapter 8. This is not just about physical blindness. We'll find out at the end of the sermon, this is about spiritual blindness as well. Like the disciples who said, whose fault is this? What kind of karma is this? Well, disciples, you're wrong. It's not karma at all. This guy is meeting Jesus. So the third conversation that we get to have goes this way. It's tell us. Verse 13. And these are the religious experts that saw this guy probably walking back and forth, getting his eyes clean. They're carrying water. Some of these people were people who had to drop their stones because they couldn't win an argument with Jesus, and then they picked him back up to try and kill him. These are people that are very spiritually confused in this week. They've already had some life-changing encounters with Jesus, or at least an opportunity. Some of them have squandered it, and some of them have embraced it. But let's look and see what the Pharisees say when they turn a conversation into more of an investigation. Verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. And now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. Because the blind can't be given sight on the Sabbath. That's work, right? That's a day that's supposed to be holy for God. You can't go doing miracles on the Sabbath day. I'll just tell you something. You're in trouble. This is for the shepherds of the church or anybody who aspires to leadership. When you're in leadership and God does a thing, and you find yourself around the table saying, can God do a thing, and he's already done it, you're in trouble. God works and God moves in ways that we don't anticipate or expect, like in this guy's case. God had done a thing, and the Pharisees say, not on Sabbath he didn't. Well, we're going to take it to God. He can't be God if he did it on the Sabbath. Don't let him work in church. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he received his sight. And, they wanted to know the how. Did Jesus break any rules? And I don't know. Maybe they had a rule about spitting in the dirt on a Saturday. He put mud on my eyes, the man explained. And I washed, and now I see. And some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner do miraculous signs?" And they're not talking about whether the blind man's a sinner or not. They're talking about Jesus, because he set this man free. He healed this man on the Sabbath day, a day holy to God. So they were divided. Remember what I told you? This is a period of extreme conflict over who Jesus is. This is the period that's going to take Jesus to the cross. We're not very many steps away from there as we go through the next 5 to 6 chapters. So catch this next part. They're arguing amongst themselves. And finally, verse 17, they turned again to the blind man and said, "What do you have to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." Now, when the neighbors said, "Tell us your story," he told the neighbors, "I'm the man. And the man opened my eyes." But look what he says here. The man replied, "He is a prophet." When God does a thing in your life, you're going to grow in your understanding, in your wisdom, in your recognition. This man had already taken the next step. It wasn't a man that healed him, it was a prophet that healed him. The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they went to the man's parents and had conversation number 4. Conversation number 4, they go to the parents and they're like, is this your son? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? My guess is some of these people on the way to temple over the years had tossed alms to this blind beggar whose only income was begging. So maybe it's a fiduciary thing, like they want to know, has this guy been stealing from us? That's the best case scenario. I love the parents' reply. "We know he's our son, and we know he was born blind. But how can we say now, but how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him." Why? Well, on one level, that's just legit. They weren't there, maybe. They didn't see it, maybe. On the other level, they were building a case. This is kind of like the adulterous woman story. They're out to get Jesus at this point. He's healing on the Sabbath. And everybody connected to that is in danger of some trouble. So the parents throw their son under the bus. Ask him. I don't know what he ever did to his parents, but that was their response. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. They were in the middle of being banned from church, but not just church, like their cultural center. Life as they knew it would be over if they said, "Yeah, Jesus did a thing and he sees now." So instead they say, "Ask my son," who, by the way, probably really wasn't welcome in the synagogue because he was that terrible blind guy. Verse 23, that was why his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." Verse 24, conversation number 5. The second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." Talk about speaking out of both sides of your mouth. They're laying a trap for this guy. "Hey, come in. We want to hear your story. We're the religious leaders of our village. We want to hear. Let's give glory to God about what the sinner did to you on the Sabbath." verse 26 or verse 25. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. It's literally the only thing I know about Jesus. And honestly, this guy was now the local expert on Jesus because he had had an encounter with Jesus, and his experience absolutely transformed his life. And the only thing that he was about in that moment was, I was blind and now I see, and that's Jesus in my life, and I've never met the guy. I've never seen him, at least. Verse 26, when they asked him, what did he do to you? Remember, that's all about the work on the Sabbath. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And not because they just want to celebrate the miracle, but because they want to trap the Savior, the miracle worker. What did he do to open your eyes? And he answered, I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? And then they hurled insults at him. That was obviously not the case. They weren't interested in following Jesus. They were interested in persecuting Jesus. They wanted to pick those stones back up. They wanted to release the guards on him. You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. If I had 20 minutes to talk about how ludicrous this verse is. This centuries before, we've heard this story about this Moses guy, and he did all these wild things in the desert, and he gave us the law, which is really what they're referring to. He gave us this, and we know this, and we live this. As a matter of fact, we've even added to it just to make sure we don't break it. We've made up rules to enforce the rules. And they're like, yeah, we'll stick with Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as far as this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from, which was also a lie. They'd had that discussion in the previous chapter, and they lied about it then too. We talked about that. The man answered, now, that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes? We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will, and nobody has ever heard of the opening of the eyes of a man born blind. By the way, had these religious leaders heard about what Jesus had been doing the last couple of years? Absolutely they had. They had fought it tooth and nail. They'd brought the same accusation before. Don't do this on the Sabbath, they said. It's ludicrous, the arguments they set up. Verse 32, nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't do a thing. He couldn't do nothing. That's what the text says. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth, and how dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Do you see this story? And why this is the only story this man will ever need to believe in Jesus and to let go of the lies that were being fed to him. So there's one more conversation. And this is a conversation with Jesus. Jesus comes back at the end of the chapter, and it goes like this. Jesus heard in verse 35 that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And who is this, sir? The man asked. Tell me so I may believe in him. And Jesus, to paraphrase it, I am the man. I am the prophet. I am the Messiah. And he's not boasting. He's just letting this man meet his very purpose for birth. The reason he was born blind. You know? Like, we don't ever get to know the cause of this man's pain, but we get to know how it ends. And it's an amazing ending. Who is he, sir? Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you. And the man says, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And then Jesus says something super hard and really cool. Maybe that's showing a dark side of my heart, but what he says is, for judgment I have come into the world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Those men that had just thrown him out of the temple, they were the blind. They needed to see. In God's eyes, he values every one of us in our stories. He loves each of us. And he is hurt and shamed when we let things like law, the law of Moses, make us feel like we're something special instead of just the grace of God that makes us special. And so here's what today's about. Verse 40. These Pharisees, some of these really religious people, some Pharisees who were with him, they heard him say this and they asked, what? Are we blind too? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. The spiritually blind men in this story, the blind men are these people, these Pharisees, that don't get they're guilty of this sin. They think that they're good enough, that the law makes them good enough, that they're just good people and that they're deserving of all good things like karma. But in reality, Jesus says, you're blind. You don't see your own guilt. Here's the deal. It takes humility to see your own guilt. And I've talked to many of you. I know the humility you have. And it's not your past behavior that has ruined you. It's not your past behavior that has blessed you. It's this encounter with Jesus that changed you. And one encounter with Jesus changes everything. And it's what I want most on earth for you and for everyone you know. The little girls that walked by your house, offered to paint your house, I want them to know this. And because you made a simple invite, they came. And their story is going to end different than the story these Pharisees faced that day. But it's the same loving Savior that says, you're more than your pain, you're more than your sickness, you're more than your weakness, you're more than the tough part of the story you're in right now. And I don't know what's causing the hurt and heartache and the struggle that you're in, but I know who can redeem it. And open your eyes, because he opened mine to my own sin, my own pain, my own guilt, and said, if you want to be free, follow me. And that's my prayer for us as a church, is keep offering that to people, keep experiencing that in our own life. Would you stand and let's close out this worship service with prayer and commitment in this song. And when we leave here, let's go and sin no more. And by that I mean let's not throw rocks at people. Let's put those stones down and accept that we too have been set free by the light of the world. We too have been invited to living water. We too can wash the mud off of our face and see Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to this, that moment when I truly see for the first time the glory of God. Like God himself, face to face. Like here, the best day here is going to be disappointing compared to the first day there. We're going to close our eyes to this mess of a world, this mess we've made of the world, and we are going to open them to a Father that embraces us. And the first words we're going to hear is, welcome home, good and faithful. Come and drink. It's all who are thirsty, come and drink. And there will be no more pain, no more sorrow, no more wondering why, but simply just the joyful embrace of a God that loves us as we see his face for the first time. Let's close in worship.